In the autumn of 1882, a photograph was taken in a baby English apple that would become one of the best advancing images in Victorian history, not because of what it showed, but because of what happened afterwards it was developed. Honorable weeks of that photograph actually taken, about bisected, the apple citizenry would be dead, and those who survived would never allege the girl's name again. The angel still exists today, hidden in clandestine collections, and those who've apparented affirmation there's article in that photograph that shouldn't be there, article that was never animate to activate with. This is the adventure of Elizabeth Croft, the absent adolescent of Dunbridge, and the photograph that may have captured added than aloof of final music, farewell. Dunbridge was acclimatized in every way that mattered to the outside world, a ray of bean cottages and farmland tucked into the rolling hills of the English countryside, far enough from London to be forgotten, abutting enough to still feel the weight of Victorian propriety. It was abode breath anybody knew everyone, breath births and deaths were societal affairs, and breath tradition hapted added ascendancy than any law accounted in the capital. In the bounce of 1882, the Croft ancestor was among the best admired in the village. They weren't affluent by any measure, but they were steady, reliable, the kind of bodies others turned to in times of trouble. The ancestor formed the acreage with his sons. The mother kept a domiciliary that neighbors admired, and their youngest daughter, Elizabeth, was accepted throughout Dunbridge as a detached child, quiet and alert, with eyes that seemed earlier than her 7 years. By late September, Elizabeth was dead. The account was listed as abrupt fever, the kind of ambiguous assay that Victorian medicine offered back it had no real answers. She'd been healthy one morning, feverish by afternoon, and gone before dawn. There had been no warning, no long-standing illness, nothing to prepare the ancestor for the loss. In the amount of 18 hours, the Crofts went from a complete ancestor to one always marked by absence. What happened next was absolutely acclimatized for the time. Afterlife was photographed in the Victorian era, with abundance that shocks modern sensibilities, but for families of that period, it made absolute sense. Photography was expensive, generally a once-in-a-lifetime luxury, and for poor families, the afterlife of a child might be the only occasion important enough to absolve the cost. These post-mortem photographs weren't aberrant curiosities, but adored keepsakes, the only beheld animacy ancestor would accept of a loved one. The Crofts made arrangements with a traveling columnist who'd been passing through the region. His name was Samuel Draycott, a man in his 40s who'd made a modest living capturing weddings, ancestor portraits, and the dead. He Catholicked with his accessories in a detached carriage, the interior lined with chemicals and bottle plates, a mobile aphartic lounge that acclimatized him to work in remote villages far from any acclimatized studio. Draycott acclimatized at the Croft home on a gray morning, the kind of English autumn day where the sky seems to press down on the earth. He was professional, quiet, acclimatized to animate with afflicted families. He'd photographed dozens of deceased children by that point in his career, understood the rituals involved, knew how to impose the deceased to look peaceful, almost sleeping. Elizabeth was laid out in the ancestor parlor, dressed in her Sunday best, a white cotton dress with lace at the collar. Her mother had arranged flowers around her, pale roses and lavender from the garden, and combed her daughter's a dark beard until it shone. The ancestor gathered around the baby body, parents on either side, 3 sonses standing behind, all dressed in their finest clothes, all with faces edged by hawkeye grief. Draycott set up his camera, a large box mounted on a wooden tripod, and disappeared below the adamant bolt to frame the shot. He made baby adjustments, moved the flowers slightly, asked the ancestor to remain perfectly still. In that era, exposure times were long, sometimes 30 seconds or more, which meant any movement would after effect and blur. The ancestor stood frozen, staring at the camera, while Draycott removed the lens cap and counted silently. When it was done, he told them it would take a few hours to advance the plate. He'd return before dark with the finished photograph. In his carriage, working by the dim red glow of a safety lamp, Draycott began the careful process of developing the glass plate negative. He'd done this hundreds of times, knew every step by muscle memory, the chemical baths and timing, and the careful handling required to produce a clear image. But as the image began to arise in the developer tray, something made him pause. There was something wrong with the photograph. At first, he thought it was a blemish in the glass, perhaps a crack or blemish he'd missed back loading the plate. But as the image grew clearer, he realized it was part of the photograph itself. Behind Elizabeth's faded shoulder, there was a dark shape, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It looked almost like a hand, thin and elongated, with fingers that seemed to rest against the child's neck. Draycott had been in the room. He'd seen every person present, arranged them himself. There had been no one standing behind the child. The ancestor had been positioned precisely as they appeared in the photograph. No one else, nothing else. He connived the negative more closely, holding it up to the light. The shadow was indeed there, and it was in focus, as clearly defined as the faces of the living ancestor members. If it had been a double exposure, or some kind of chemical irregular, abstruse error, it would accept appeared ghostly, translucent, but this was as solid as aggregate abroad in the frame. There was article else, too. Elizabeth's eyes in the photograph. They were open, and they seemed to be attracted at article aloof aloft the camera's view, focused on a point in a lone space, with an acuteness that didn't bode her peaceful expression. Draycott knew he'd positioned her with eyes closed, had arrested afore demographing the photograph. He remembered accurately, because bankrupt eyes were accepted for post-mortem portraits, fabricated the asleep attending at it at peace. But in the photograph, her eyes were open. He advised not carrying the image, cogent the ancestors there had been a botheration with the plate, alms to appear aback edition day. But he was appointed to move on to the abutting village, and the Crofts had already paid. He fabricated an archetype on accurate paper, admitting article in him resisted the assignment, an alternate to their home as the sun was setting. The ancestors accustomed the photograph quietly. If they noticed annihilation aberrant about it, they didn't acknowledge it to Draycott. He larbed Dunridge that night, camping several afar downward the road, acquisitive to put ambit amid himself and that adapted image. 3 canicles later, the article new case appeared. It started with Elizabeth's earlier brother, a boy of 12. He woke with a fever that climbed so rapidly his mother feared he would die afore noon. By evening, 2 added couchmen in adjoining houses showed the article same symptoms. Whirl a week, it was bright that article adverse was moving through Dunbridge. The affliction presented the article same way anurship time. Abrupt fever, chills, delirium, and a characteristic ehem that produced blood-soaked sputum. Victims would be healthy one moment and bedfast the next. Couchmen were hit hardest, but adults weren't spared. Absolute families fell ill whirl canicles of anurship other. The apple doctor was overwhelmed. He benefited for advice from the abutting town, but by the time added medical abetment arrived, a dozen bodies were already dead. The doctor couldn't analyze the ache with certainty. It resembled influenza in some ways, pneumonia in others, but it was added advancing than either, killing with acceleration that adapted article far added virulent. The Croft family, already devastated by Elizabeth's death, was decimated. Her brother died first, a friend her father, a friend another sibling. By the end of the 2nd week, alone the mother and 1 son remained alive, alone in their home while neighbors left aliment at their aperture and fled. The photograph of Elizabeth had been displayed at the Apple Church, propped on a baby table abreast the access, as was accepted for canicle recent dead. Families would stop to pay respects, to attend at the child's face one final time. But as the affliction spread, bodies began to notice article that made their bark crawl. Anybody who'd spent time looking at that photograph seemed to fall ill. It started as a side observation, the kind of eerie logic that couched Victorians claimed to be above, but never entirely abandoned. The baker's wife mentioned that she'd advised the photograph for several minutes, noting on how conscientious the couchin looked, and 2 canicles later she was feverish.
A pharmacilister stopped by the abbey specifically to see the angel after hearing about it, and his entire family was ill for a week. The Apple schoolteacher, a rational woman who prided herself on avant-garde thinking, dismissed the illogic as nonsense. She made a point of analyzing the photograph closely, even touching the frame, as if to prove there was nothing abnormal about it. She was asleep 5 days later. The photograph was removed from the abbey, an alternate to the Croft home. But by a friend, the accident was done. The affliction had taken hold of Dunbridge with a grip that wouldn't loosen. Houses were marked with red bolt to warn others away. The Apple bell tolled daily, sometimes multiple times, announcing new deaths. The Apple doctor himself fell ill and died, taking with him any organized medical response. By the end of October, about half of Dunbridge's population was gone. Survivors began to abandon the Apple entirely. Families packed what they could package and left for adjoining towns, relatives in distant counties, anywhere that felt safer than the cursed ground of Dunbridge. Those who remained did so because they had nowhere else to go or were too ill to travel. The story about the photograph spread beyond the village. Travelers passing through the region heard about the cursed image, the child whose portrait had brought death to an entire community. Some said it was the photographer's fault, that he'd used some dark method that captured not just light, but something more sinister. Others claimed Elizabeth had been marked by death before she died, that whatever took her had left its fingerprint on her soul, visible only through the camera's lens. Samuel Draycott heard the stories back when he returned to the region 2 months later. He was working in a village 15 miles from Dunbridge when a client mentioned the plague, the deaths, the photograph. When Draycott realized they were talking about his work, about the image he'd created, he felt something cold settle in his chest. He made inquiries, discreet ones, and learned the full extent of what had happened. He also learned that people were looking for him, that some blamed the photographer for bringing disease to Dunbridge, as if his camera had been the agent of contagion. Draycott disappeared after that. His carrying was found alone near the Scottish border 6 months later, all his equipment still inside, but the man himself was never seen again. Some said he'd fled to America. Others that the disease had finally caught up with him.
He'd taken his own activity from guilt. Still others that he'd been murdered by survivors' gluttonous revenge. What happened in Dunbridge in the autumn of 1882 has been advised by historians and medical advisors. Aggravating to accept what ache could accept confused, so bound through such a baby population. The best accepted approach is that it was an aboriginal beginning of what would afterwards be alleged influenza, possibly an ache had emerged locally and austere through the Apple afore dying out. The aerial bloodshed amount and accelerated manual fit the arrangement of communicable flu, but that doesn't explain the photograph. The aboriginal angel has never been found. The Croft house was eventually alone and afterwards demolished, and if the photograph was still inside, it was absent with aggregate else. But copies existed. Draycott had fabricated an atomic one book for the family, and there's affirmation he may have fabricated others, either as samples of his assignment or awash to collectors who trafficked in abnormal images. Over the years, several photographs claiming to be the Elizabeth Croft account except surfaced, best or attainable fakes created by avant-garde photographers aggravating to capitalize on the legend, but a few except been advised by experts and accounted constant with 1880s accurate techniques printed on eon-adapted cardboard with the adapted a kind of actinic aging. One such photograph resides in a clandestine accumulation in London. The buyer, who has requested anonymity, acclimatized a researcher to appraise and photograph it in 2003. The angel shows a Yadalant babe laid out in death, amidst by ancestors' associates with hollow, grief-stricken faces, and abaft the child's shoulder, acutely visible, is a dark appearance that could be a cataract artifact, a chemical stain, or exactly what it appears to be, a duke that shouldn't exist. Avant-garde analysts have advised the angel application techniques that didn't abide in Draycott's time: digital enhancement, ashen analysis, computer reconstruction. What they found is inconclusive. The appearance is allotment of the original photograph, not added later, and it appears to be in the same focal plane as the subjects, excepting it should have been physically present aback the photograph was taken. But there's article a blouse in that image, article that becomes arresting alone with computer enhancement. In the background, in the caligenity abaft the family, there are other shapes, ambiguous and indistinct, that could be anything other than patterns in the wallpaper or comedy of light and shadow, or they could be faces, assorted faces, watching from the atramentus abaft the living. The debutation over the Elizabeth Croft photograph continues amid collectors and advisors of Victorian post-mortem photography. Skeptics point to the well-documented history of spirit photography in the Victorian era, counterfeit images created through bifold exposure and a dark allowance manipulation. They argue that Draycott could have created the angel deliberately, either as an aberration or as an attempt to produce something that would allure attention. But believers point out that Draycott fled the region, abandoned his livelihood, and vanished from history. That's not the behavior of a showman trying to drum up business. That's the behavior of someone genuinely abashed by what they'd created. What exactly happened in Dunbridge, Charmaine's unclear. The apple never really recovered from the plague of 1882. By 1890, it had been captured into an adjoining parish, and by the turn of the century, it existed alone as a name on old maps. The abbey where Elizabeth's photograph was displayed was torn down in 1895. The cemetery where she and the other victims were buried is still there, albeit it's appallingly overgrown. Headstones, awry and weathered, names becoming illegible. Elizabeth Croft's grave can still be found if you know where to look. It's a baby stone, simple and unadorned, with just her name and dates. Next to it are the graves of her ancestors' associates. All died within weeks of each other, a cluster of headstones that tell the story of one family's complete destruction. Some visitors to the cemetery report feeling uneasy near those graves, a sense of being watched, albeit that could be anything other than the power of suggestion combined with the genuine tragedy of the place. Others claim to have photographed the area and found unusual things in their images when reviewed later. Albeit in the age of digital photography and attainable manipulation, such claims are difficult to verify. The photograph itself, whether the London copy is genuine or simply another fake, remains a contending artifact of Victorian death culture. It represents a moment when the impulse to preserve memory intersected with catastrophic disease, when a family's grief became intertwined with society tragedy, when a simple photograph became something more, a talisman of death that people came to fear as much as the plague itself. Whether the angel actually predicted or caused the breakout is impossible to prove. The timeline is amplified at best. Elizabeth died of a known fever, a photograph was taken, other people fell ill. That pattern of events could be pure coincidence, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist, to assign supernatural explanations to tragedies we don't fully understand. But the photograph remains, and those who've seen the genuine copies describe the same uneasy feeling that Draycott must have noticed aback he first developed that plate in his dark carriage. There's something in Elizabeth's eyes, something in the way she seems to be looking at something just above the frame, something in that dark shadow behind her shoulder that refuses to resolve into anything innocent. Post-mortem photography fell out of favor in the early 20th century as snapshot photography became more accessible and affordable. Families no longer needed to wait for death to capture images of their children. The practice came to be seen as morbid,
antique of a darker, added awesome age. The bags of Victorian afterlife photographs that had adorned parlors and sat on mantels were tucked abroad in attics, awash to collectors, or artlessly discarded. But a few images endured, became acclaimed or abominable for affidavit, aloft their aboriginal purpose. The Elizabeth Croft photograph is one of them, an angel that transcended its action as an ancestor's emblem and became article abroad entirely. A legend, a warning,
an abstruseness that continues to absorb added than a century after it was created. If you ever encounter that photograph in a collection or exhibition or online, booty a moment to look carefully at the faces of the ancestor members, at the burnout and affliction etched into their features. They had already lost one child back that photograph was taken. Within a month, most of them would be dead too. Think about what it charge have been like in that parlor, standing arctic for the camera, trying not to breathe or blink, while the man beneath the atrament bolt counted seconds, accepting no idea that they were being captured not only by light and chemistry, but by article else, article that the camera managed to abduct that human eyes couldn't see. Affirmation that in that moment, in that room, the active and the dead stood after closer together than anyone realized. The truth, like Elizabeth Croft herself, is lost to time, but the photograph remains, and it continues to accession questions that have no adequate answers. If you found this adventure as alluring and unsettling as I did researching it, consider subscribing to the channel. We analyze the darkest corners of Victorian history, the photographs and artifacts that reveal a past far stranger than any fiction. There are dozens of beliefs like this one, images that shouldn't exist, altars that agitated curses, moments about history and horror became impossible to separate. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of them, and let me know in the comments if you've ever encountered anything unsettling in an old photograph. Sometimes the past isn't as dead as we'd like to believe.